Good day, everyone. I am Farha Ikdar Khan here at the Center for Strategic and Contemporary Research. I bring you the 16th edition of Experts Dispatch, CSCR's video podcast series. As for CSCR, we are an independent policy institute in Islamabad, exploring avenues of research, advocacy, and consultancy, and presenting original takes on diverse matters of domestic and global relevance. Likewise, for our experts dispatch, we invite specialists, policymakers, and academicians to share their expertise on a wide array of issues that are of national and international significance. Today, we will be asking our distinguished experts some important questions on the knowledge production of the international relations of South Asia. Our expert of today needs no introduction. However, for the uninformed, he is the go-to expert in the area of knowledge production on Pakistan and is currently the executive director of the Rhodes Initiative. It is my honor to welcome Dr. Ahmed Waqas. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Sir, I'll go straight to the questions.
hmm
Knowledge producing cores increasingly exist beyond the West. Do you think core periphery engagement in the non West may occur without reference to the Western networks or practices?
So you see, I think we live in a very globalized world, and the way it is all structured, we cannot escape those structures, even if we tried very hard. And escaping those structures means that we, instead of coming up with new knowledges, we are isolating our knowledges. So the idea is not to escape or exit the system. The idea is threefold, basically. Firstly, you need to make these structures, these publishing circuits, the peer reviewers, the international intellectual community, you have to make them understand the problems that sudden knowledge producers, such as think tanks or scholars or intellectual space, so that they have a little empathy of how we go through processes in ways which are very dissimilar to theirs. The second is that by producing better knowledge, and when I say better knowledge, I mean something that is more methodologically rigorous, something which is more indigenous, something that brings new perspectives. What you need to do is engage with a dialogue, an intellectual dialogue with Western scholars and Western knowledge producing communities. So you see, in that dialogue, then you have debates, you have discussions. What is happening right now is that even though on many different levels we are engaging with scholars internationally, but most of that happens on the theoretical, we take the theoretical premise that is Western in nature, without looking at indigenous ways of thinking. And so there is a disconnect. So while you're saying a different thing, essentially, you are becoming more Eurocentric in your concepts and your ideas. So what I would suggest that what we need to do is that we need to come out of that Eurocentric mindset, and then through our own indigenous research, indigenous knowledges, we engage in a dialogue with the with the Western scholars and intellectual community in a more meaningful way, so that we can communicate across borders that our realities are different than your realities, and our way of functioning is different than your way of functioning. And now, if you look, there is a trend in many different countries. So, for example, we hear of the emergence of a Chinese school of thought in international relations, and we hear of an Indian school of thought in international relations. So I think that that is how you need to start thinking, that how do you unravel the basic fabrics of the knowledge that you already possess, keeping Eurocentric influences outside and filling them with indigenous thought, and then indulge with a dialogue with the international scholarly community.
Right, sir. But then again, a West and non West are not homogeneous entities. Countries in the non-West may have different experiences to the West, but also different experiences among themselves. So, how do you think can we decolonize and democratize social science research on South Asia?
So again, there's a huge debate on this. I mean, on one side, there are those who think that international relations need to be more globalized. And when they say more globalized, they're talking about bringing the South in because most of the theories and the literature that were emerging from the West were essentially Eurocentric in character and still are to quite an extent. It was only later that many, ideas started coming up, which would start bringing the Southern scholars into the discussion, theories like post-colonialism or even post-structuralism, constructivism opened that gate. So there's that idea of a globalization, but then there is this idea of provincializing international relations, which is essentially what you're trying to say here, that the provincialization of international relations means that every country, every nation has a specific subset of knowledges, and it is through those knowledges that they act on the international stage, and hence IR should cater to the specificities of the local community. So again, as I said, there are two debates on this. I believe that it should we should provincialize international relations, and I agree with you there because, for example, there is no case in the world uh, such as Pakistan. I mean, you might say that, oh no, that's not true because a lot of countries go through dictatorial regimes, and a lot of countries have very patriarchal undertones to their international relations. But then I would say that, but then a lot of countries are different in culturally. So for example, a country or a state in Latin America, might have gone through the same dictatorial or, processes, but culturally at least they're the same. Plus the indigenous knowledges are the same, are different. Plus the way of interacting with the international community is different. The histories through which they have evolved is different. So, all these things come together to form a subset where your knowledge then becomes very specific to who you identify yourself as a people. And so I believe that this should be the way moving forward, that instead of trying to contribute to a larger global community, what you need to do is that you need to bring in indigenous thought, and through that indigenous thought, do indigenous research, on international relations, and then enter into a dialogue on the global front with different scholars, intellectuals, communities, large producing communities, and that's how you move forward.
Also, talking about indigenous knowledge and specificity, recently there have been instances where non-Pakistani academics have been reached out to make contributions to knowledge production as an authority on Pakistan. What are the conditions under which it is possible to make such authoritative claims about Pakistan?
To be fairly honest, everybody's making authoritative claims about Pakistan, and they've been doing this for a very, very long time. And I think it's not. So you see, it's not that we give somebody authority. Discourse provides that authority to people to talk. So automatically somebody emerges as an authoritative subject, and people start to, follow or listen or read whoever discourse picks up as this authority. And so you'd find a lot of people talking about Pakistan. And so I really don't think that we are in a place to choose that. But what we are in a place to do is, and which we are not doing, is that instead of involving ourselves in a debate, in a way we can contest those claims in a meaningful way, in a more methodologically rigorous way, in a more conceptually or intellectual way. I think that is where we as knowledge producers in Pakistan are lacking. And because our voices, for many different reasons, are not strong enough to contest those voices that are coming from the West. Hence, those voices emerge as the dominant interpretation through which Pakistan is brought to the world. So when you look at Western authors, you find a lot of them talking about Pakistan's failed state, failing state, fragile state, greedy state, garrison state. I sometimes lose count of the number of labels that they put on Pakistan. And what happens is that so when for example somebody says that you're a failed state or you're a garrison state or you're a fragile state, for instance, the first instinct of Pakistani uh, uh, intellectuals is, and you read it in the news, no, we're not a failed state. Oh, no, we're not a fragile state. Oh, we're a nuclear nation. How can we be fragile? We're so strong. But there are two, three problems that happen there. One, the debate on the fragile state that emerges from within Pakistan does not actually contest the measurements on which that category has been made. So, for example, if somebody's talking about Pakistan fragile state status and they're talking about poor law and order situation or poor governance situation, most of us would try to rebuke that case because they'll say, oh, we're a nuclear country. Again, there's a mismatch. So why don't you first question the measurements on which you have called Pakistan a failed state or a fragile state or a failing state? The second thing is that nobody asks that who came up with the word failed state? Who came up with the word fragile state? How did you come up with standards and impose them on us? And how did we uncritically just take those standards as measurements to, evaluate ourselves? How did that happen? So the point is that going back to the same thing, to the earlier point, I think what needs to happen again is that the research processes and the knowledge production processes within Pakistan need to mature in a certain way that they involve themselves in a meaningful debate, with the broader community rather than restricting itself to just 2, 3 dimensions of international relations, such as nuclear studies or Pakistan-India relation, Pakistan-US relation, Pakistan-Afghanistan, Pakistan and terrorism. I mean, you'd be appalled to know that the five categories, these 5 categories, that's 90% of the research in Pakistan international relations. But international relations is so much broader than that.
That is so true, sir. So, knowledge production and exchange are shaped by personal professional circumstances and institutional cultural barriers. So, research processes, they rely heavily on the free time of the researchers. And if researchers are always working with constrained resources and other forms of precarity, how can we expect a shift in the way knowledge production is imagined and then pursued in South Asia or for that matter, Pakistan?
Hmm. Just a second. Oh, okay. So see, now look at there are knowledge production constraints all over the world. But again, it is how do you incentivize those procedures in a way that motivates researchers to do meaningful research? Now, if you look, almost all universities in Pindi, Islamabad are doing a PhD in international relations, offering a PhD in international relations. And so this means, iska matlab ye hai ki every PhD scholar is doing a PhD thesis, which is around 80 to 100,000 words, right? And when these scholars come out, now the Higher Education Commission expects that these scholars should turn their research into publications, right? We're also gung-ho on publications. And those publications are research journal articles, right? But shouldn't most of that effort be directed towards publishing a book? You would say. I mean, PhD thesis, 80,000 words. The normal academic publishers publish work from, you know, 70 to 80,000 words. And so, but there is no incentive to publish a book in Pakistan. So, for example, the Higher Education Commission's promotion criteria do not list book as an incentive for promotion.
Mm.
So
Right.
anybody who is now in the academia and wants to write a book cannot write a book because that's a waste of time because that won't lead to promotion. And what is happening is that automatically, because there is no motivation, sooner rather than later, writing a book is another skill set because you are presenting something to a wider audience, right? As opposed to a thesis, which is written only for your examiners or your evaluators. And so what is happening is that because of that, much of the PhD thesis just gets converted in a couple of articles, and that is about it. And don't you think that's a waste of resources? You put 4, 5 years, 8 years on a certain instance to write 80,000 words, and the best you've done to utilize that is a journal article or two. So, number one. Number two, because in Pakistan, methodology normally means that take 5 interviews, take 6 interviews. Who do you know? Who do you know? Who do you know? Write down names. It's a matter of a couple of weeks before your entire research is over. Nobody understands why. And so you're so methodologically weak that most of your work does not make into international publishing, international journals. And so you're restricted to the local national circuit. And because there's a rat race. So, for example, if you look at how the Pakistani tenure track system is structured, so you've got to write 10 journal articles in 6 years. Now, 10 journal articles in 6 years is very easy if you're looking at the Pakistan national circuit, academic publishing circuit. But if you look at the international academic publishing circuit, articles get rejected and get accepted after 4 years, 5 years, 3 years, 2 years. There is a lot of time there. So what happens is that now, because the promotion criteria says 10 articles, 6 years, and people don't have the energy or the time to, pitch their articles to international publishers, most of them get restricted to local journals. So, from 2000, so for my research in the book that I wrote on constructing Pakistan, from 2006 till 2016, I took the top 100 journals, according to Skimago, and I looked at how many Pakistanis published in it, and you'd be surprised there were only nine people from Pakistan who published in international journals. Now, imagine how that works. So it's not just resources. I understand how it is very easy. And there is a certain problem as well when it comes to resources in the term that, the international community doesn't understand how we grapple with resources. And when we say resources, for instance, we don't have access to a lot of journals on the internet. We do not have amazing libraries here. We have very limited libraries. So of course, the way we are looking at literature is not as contemporary as our Western counterparts would or our Western colleagues would. So we are already walking a very narrow corridor. But then you look at how we are de-incentivized within the country to follow a certain weak structure, and you come to find out that the problem with resources is not as much as resources as it is of a lack of understanding in this country of what it means to do a social sciences research. So I think that should answer your question.
So the hierarchies of knowledge production also tend to place academic knowledge in different sorts of compartments. And they separate academic research from knowledge that is generated in non-university spaces. Why do we see a constant dismissal of non academic, local, and activist knowledge, especially within the academia?
I think that dismissal happens everywhere, not just Pakistan. Because I think there are different ways of looking at knowledge. So, for example, when you look at activist knowledge, you're looking at the practice-based knowledge. You're looking at a practitioner's experience of what is happening. When you're looking at academic knowledge, it's more research intensive. It's more methodologically rigorous because they're looking at from a different vantage point. And if you look at other thinkers, then that thought is coming from a certain philosophy grounded within their indigenous thinking. And so they're looking at it from another. I completely agree that there has to be a fusion of these three knowledges so that a more concrete understanding of any one thing or any subject of any topic should come up. But again, academics have largely been confined to their ivory towers, and they seldom venture out of it. And with a PhD comes a certain sense of knowledge superiority, and the power that comes with that. When I say power, I don't mean that they become bureaucrats, and they do become bureaucrats at times. But by power, I means just what you earlier said, the authority to say something, then comes to the academic who is more qualified to say something about it. And that is how, again, the society structures itself, you know. So if you see that that hierarchy exists in Pakistan, mostly because Pakistani culture looks at the hierarchy in a certain way. So if you look at our conferences, and we've attended so many conferences in Pakistani think tanks and even the National Security Dialogue, and so many different conferences. Just evaluate the number of participation of academics in those conferences vis-a-vis bureaucrats, and you will find out who has more authority to speak on a subject. In a similar hierarchical way, if you look at academics and activists on a certain platform, and you'll find out who has more authority to speak on the subject. So that hierarchy has always been there, even though ideally these three communities of knowledge producers should come together to, provide a certain uh, view of a subject or a topic. But normally they don't. It's rare, it's seldom that they come together. Start rethinking about what it means to do social sciences research. Until the time we don't rethink about how social sciences research benefits our society, until the time we don't rethink about how important social sciences is for the development of a society, I don't think that these power structures will dissipate in any way.
You said that there is a need to diversify and rethink both the content of academic knowledge and the process of its production and dissemination. This is my last question, how can we critically rethink about the politics of knowledge production and dissemination?
Look at it this way. I mean, uh, we all understand what colonialism was, and we understand what imperialism is, and we also know about Eurocentrism a little. But how many times have you come across debates that actually include these precepts? So there is a never, very little. So there's a propensity within the Pakistani academia to decontextualize and dehistoricize problems and present them as contemporary. There is every contemporary problem has a history and a context. But what happens is that somewhere down the line, that history and that context kind of fades away. So, for example, if Pakistan is being labeled as a fragile or a failed state, I mean, there's definitely a context to that, right? There's a history to that, right? There are the many conceptual ways in which you can conceptualize why or how Pakistan has reached at a point where the international community thinks that Pakistan is a failed or fragile state. And then you can look at it from a colonial slash neo-colonial vantage point. You can look at it from a Marxist vantage point. You can look at it from an imperialist vantage point. You can take so many different ways to think about how we come to be what we are projected to be. But where did that all go? Instead, our academia is confined to two or three concepts at best, two or three theories: realism, balance of power, liberalism, neoliberalism, capitalism. So I think what's lacking is the the creative imagination to try to understand why we have become what we have become, and why we have become what the international community thinks we have become. And there are different ways in which we have to take it forward. So the first thing that we need to rethink is, how do we bring our history back in to our discussions? How do we bring the context back into our discussions? I mean, the story, for example, of Pakistan's nuclear problems doesn't start with Pokhran 1971. It starts with 1947. But whenever you're looking at these things, 1970, so where did the 1947 to 1971 history go away? Where did that context go away? It's a different context, right? So, one. Second, I think that rethinking cannot happen till the time we do not have a thriving, vibrant publishing community that publishes research in our own language. So you see, for example, let's say you've got research coming out in England, okay? And in England, there is a professor who writes something, does research, and he publishes a book, puts it in the bookstore. Now, everybody from their O levels to their universities, to a common man driving a cab, can open the book and start reading it. There might be a difficulty in comprehending it, and there might be a difficulty in understanding it, but there's no problem in reading it because it's their language. So when somebody says something in English, a person who is English speaking would understand what the other person's trying to say. But what happens is that when we start reading in English, so there are three problems there. When we start reading in English, we have to make an interpretation. So we're reading it in English, we translate it in Urdu, then we retranslate it in English, and then we reproduce it. And through this entire process, half of the meaning of what we're trying to say is lost, number one. Number two, which means that only a very small segment, a very few people in this country can access that kind of knowledge. You need to make that knowledge public. But a cab driver can't read an English book in Pakistan, but a cab driver can read the books in Pakistan. So I think one of the things that you need to do is, there should be a lot of emphasis on converting English texts into Urdu texts so that you can make it available for the public. And the second that you need to do is that there should be a thriving, vibrant Urdu publishing community that does not restrict itself to novels and digests, but actually puts forward, meaningful knowledge, research-based knowledge, conceptual knowledge in a way that a common person can understand. Otherwise, all we will be restricted to do is discuss events rather than concepts, which we continue to do right now.
Thank you so much, sir, for such eloquent and comprehensive answers. With this, we conclude the latest edition of Experts Dispatch. I'm grateful to our expert for his time and expertise. Thank you so much for being with us, sir. And the rest of you have a very good rest of the day.
Thank you so much.